So thank you to the FET committee. I was not at all sure about the 5-minute format when the call went out for proposals, but I'm really loving it. I hope you all are too. I'd like to also thank Catherine Britton, who invited me to write an article on authenticity for the Positive Psychology News Daily. And there are a lot of details in that article about the research that it's founded on. And so if you have an interest after the presentation, please by all means check it out. Authenticity is the heart of how we live. It's worthy of your deep consideration, even if it's not one of your signature strengths, even or maybe especially if there are times in your life where you don't feel authentic. Which brings me to my relationship with my sister. Cheryl and I were 7 years apart, I being the younger, and although my mom often dressed us alike, in many ways we were not alike, perhaps polarized a bit. There also seemed to be more nature than nurture in the ways that we differed. Cheryl was the sky to my clouds. I was the field to her forests. My sister loved paper dolls and dating boys and finding a husband, while I enjoyed kickball and adventures of all kinds of sorts. The beautiful thing was we each flourished in our own worlds. My sister with her husband and her 4 redheaded children, and the Lutheran church right up the street, while I excelled at work and was a lover of the contemplative arts, things like long walks in the woods, poetry, nature, and meditation. Separately, we each flourished. We each realized the many benefits of authenticity, things like strong relationships, vitality, and well-being. And we were each quite authentic in our own ways. While I excelled at work and was a lover of the arts, living authentically and not unduly influenced by outside pressures. But could we be authentic together? As sisters, we were seesaw, sometimes too accommodating, sometimes holding too firm. I often felt the pain of not being understood by Cheryl, and I bet she did too. Would we ever be heart-to-heart sisters, like the Sisters in White Christmas we watched when we were kids? While we wondered about this, the years continued to pass. I called my sister on her birthday, May 3rd of 2012, and we had a very nice conversation. Our follow-up talk the next day, however, was not so good. She said the words, "I have cancer." I drove the 5 hours from my home in Madison to hers in Minneapolis many times in the weeks to come. We learned that her diagnosis was not a hopeful one. We had plenty of fun on those visits. We took her grandchildren to the Mall of America and to the zoo. We went thrift store shopping and baked recipes from our mom that we hadn't made in decades. Whatever push and pull that remained in our sisterhood was diminished, and our roles had reversed in a way. I tried my best to care for her family, and she was on an adventure that no one would choose. In late June of 2013, Cheryl called at night. She said, "I've got some difficult news to tell you," and then she began to cry. "They're sending me home with hospice," she said. "They think it's the end." I arrived the following day, just as she was being set up in her beautiful home, her hospital bed in the TV room looking out the back window, the room where we'd spent hour upon hour watching movies or playing games or sports. Her 4 grown children and their spouses were there, as well as her husband and her grandchildren. They all said the same thing to me: "She's been asking for you." The number one regret of hospice patients is one of failed authenticity. I didn't pursue a life that was true to myself. I wish I'd had the courage to follow my dreams. My sister was not one of those patients. Cheryl's dream had been creating a family, and she died as she had lived, with dozens of friends and family coming to visit her at home, bringing food and gifts and sitting beside her. Although she was in her final days, she was certainly in her own authentic, happy world. We all gathered around Cheryl and in homegrown ceremonies shared the strengths we saw in her and the many ways she had contributed to our lives. She soaked it all in calmly, even after she stopped speaking and faced her final hours. My sister died in a beautiful way, surrounded by the love of so many, until the end was too close, and we put a sign on the door saying no more visitors. Even then, there were 9 of us with her most of the time. In those final days, my sister and I found our deepest common ground. My practices of mindfulness and gratitude and rituals of hope and love fit in such a beautiful way with my sister's practices of mothering, taking care of her family to the very end, saying goodbye, and teaching us how to die with grace. Authenticity, to live one's values and beliefs, and to do it in a way that is both remaining true to yourself and accepting the truth of others. Like Cheryl and me in her final days last year, truly, authentically, heart-to-heart sisters.
Thank you, Jan. Questions? Comments? Patrick? Is there anything you wish you would have said to her when she was here?
You know, there really isn't. And for all the difficulties, of course, in 5 minutes, I couldn't go on, perhaps luckily for you, of all the ways that our relationships had clicked and not clicked throughout the years. And I think in that final year, for sure, that she had after her diagnosis, and definitely in those final days, it's as if it all falls away. So I guess if I would think about myself before that time period, say, let's say 2 years ago or 5 years ago, my goodness, why do we hold on to some of the things that we do that keeps us separate from people? And I think when you're faced with that situation, the most dire of circumstances, that can fall away. And I think the question for us is, how can we help it to fall away when the consequences aren't so dire or so immediate?
Sandy?
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you.
Again, I'm sorry. I'm gonna ask you to just move. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I agree completely that I think there aren't many readily available resources for people on positive endings, positive goodbyes, positive dying. So I agree. I think there's a need for that.
At the back, yeah. thoughts on positive grieving and how you can turn grieving into celebrating.
So there was a study done within, I think, the last year to 18 months that was done by a man named Michael Norton at Harvard, I think he's in the Harvard Business School actually, but he studied rituals of grieving and had two different groups. One group that did some writing and speaking together about the loss that they had encountered, and another group set up very simple rituals, things like writing what you'll miss on a piece of paper and then sending it out into the air, putting it on a boat and having it float into sea. Very simple rituals, but they involve the action. It's kind of an embodied way of doing it, in addition to talking and writing and, whatever your spiritual practices might be at that time. So I would encourage you to look it up. They found that people who did some sort of ritual, that it really impacted their grief experience. So they still grieved, as we all should, but that it was able to be kind of a focal point for them to understand what had happened and to begin the process of letting go. And I'm very sorry to hear about your father, Susan. Very sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan.